Bon Scott is one of the most iconic singers in rock and roll history. He was born on July 9, 1946 in Forfar, Scotland, and grew up in Kirriemuir, a town about 50 minutes north of Forfar. In 1952, Bon Scott and his family moved to Melbourne, the capital of Australia, and in 1956, they moved to Fremantle, a city on the west coast of Australia. As a teenager, Bon Scott began to really explore his musical side. In 1964, he started his first band, the Spectres. In this band, Bon Scott was actually mainly the drummer. He'd sing lead vocals occasionally. In 1966, the Spectres and the Winstons, another band from Fremantle, merged together and created the Valentines. Bon Scott was the co-lead singer in this band, and by 1970, the Valentines actually had a single called Juliet that got into Australia's national top 30s chart. The band, however, disbanded shortly after. In any case, Bon Scott's involvement with the Valentines would prove to be crucial in terms of his connection to AC/DC. As mentioned, Bon Scott was the co-lead singer in the Valentines. The other co-lead vocalist in the band was a singer named Vince Lovegrove. More on him shortly. After the Valentines ended in 1970, Bon Scott moved to Adelaide, Australia, where he joined a band called Fraternity. Fraternity would later rename themselves Fang. Interestingly, during a tour of the UK in 1973, Fang opened a series of shows for a band called Geordie. At the time, Geordie's lead singer was Brian Johnson, who of course would go on to take the lead vocalist spot in AC/DC after Bon Scott's death in 1980. As a matter of fact, Bon Scott was actually very impressed by Brian Johnson as a frontman. More on that later. Now, Fang went on hiatus in 1973, essentially leaving Bon Scott without a band. Bon Scott began working various jobs and also did some vocal work with a band called the Mount Lofty Rangers. But at this point, Bon Scott's career really wasn't getting to where he wanted it to be. On the night of May 3rd, 1974, Bon Scott was very drunk and he had a heated argument with a member of Mount Lofty Rangers during one of their rehearsals. He eventually stormed out and drove off on a motorcycle, ultimately getting into a very serious accident that put him in the hospital for several weeks. As a matter of fact, he was in a coma for 3 days. Once Bon Scott was out of the hospital, his ex-Valentine's bandmate Vince Lovegrove helped him get odd jobs here and there. Vince Lovegrove was now working on the management side of the business. As a matter of fact, it was Vince Lovegrove who introduced Bon Scott to AC/DC. AC/DC were looking for a new singer. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that at this point in time, Bon Scott was almost 28 years old, which, of course, 28 is young. But for someone who's only 21 or 19, 28 may feel like a whiles away. I'm mentioning this because when the Young brothers met Bon Scott, Malcolm was only 21 and Angus was only 19. This is relevant for the quote I'm about to share with you. In an interview from 2008, Vince Lovegrove recalled the following about introducing Bon Scott to AC/DC. Quote, "There was a young, dinky little glam band from Sydney that we both loved called AC/DC. Before another AC/DC visit, George Young, Malcolm and Angus's older brother, phoned me and said the band was looking for a new singer. I immediately told him that the best guy for the job was Bon. George responded by saying Bon's accident would not allow him to perform, and that maybe he was too old. Nevertheless, I had a meeting with Malcolm and Angus and suggested Bon as their new singer. They asked me to bring him out to the Poraka Hotel that night, and to come backstage after the show. When he watched the band, Bon was impressed, and he immediately wanted to join them, but thought they may be a bit too inexperienced and too young. The upshot was that they had a jam session that night in the home of Bon's former mentor, Bruce Howe, and at the end of the session, at dawn, it was obvious that AC/DC had found a new singer, and Bon had found a new band." End quote. The following is a quote from Irene Thornton, Bon Scott's wife at the time he first met AC/DC. In this quote, she recalls the night Bon Scott met the band. "The first time Bon saw AC/DC was in August of 1974. They came through Adelaide with the Lou Reed and Stevie Wright tour, and played their own show at the Poraka Hotel. The first time I saw AC/DC was at the Poraka Hotel in September. 'Get up there, Bon,' Vince kept saying. The band didn't have a singer that night. They were playing instrumental versions of old rock and roll standards. The boys ripped through all these classic numbers, and then finally, with enough pressure from Vince, Bon climbed onto the stage. Like Bon, the Youngs were Scottish, so there was an instant bond." End quote. Now, it has been stated on multiple occasions that Bon Scott actually worked for AC/DC as their driver before becoming their singer. However, according to the Bon Scott biography, Highway to Hell, The Life and Death of AC/DC legend Bon Scott, he never was AC/DC's driver. The following is a quote from the book. The author is Clinton Walker. "The popular myth that Bon had first been employed by AC/DC as their driver is a myth propagated by the band itself as much as anyone." End quote. In any case, Bon Scott would go on to record 6 studio records with AC/DC, though you could make the argument he was involved with 7 AC/DC records. AC/DC's debut record High Voltage was released on February 17, 1975, in Australia only. The international release version of High Voltage came out on April 30th, 1976 worldwide, and on May 14th, 1976 in the US. This version of High Voltage is significantly different than the Australian version. Only 2 songs from the Australian version appear on the 76 version. In any case, Bon Scott's time with AC/DC was tragically cut short when he died on February 19, 1980. I'll be going into the details about his passing shortly. As the story goes with AC/DC, after Bon Scott's death, Brian Johnson was eventually brought in as the band's new vocalist. Now, as mentioned earlier in the video, one of Bon Scott's earlier bands, Fang, had toured with one of Brian Johnson's earlier bands, Geordie. In an interview from 2011, Brian Johnson recalls that Bon Scott was very impressed by his stage antics during one show, even though they weren't actually stage antics. Here's the quote. "I had a terrible case of appendicitis and I went down on my side, kicking and going, oh, but I kept on singing. Apparently, Bon later told the boys, I saw this guy Brian Johnson sing, and he was great. He was on the floor kicking and screaming, what an act. Of course, it wasn't an act. I was really ill." End quote. One of the most iconic parts of AC/DC's live shows is when Angus Young gets on the lead singer's shoulders. He's done that with both Bon Scott and Brian Johnson. Brian Johnson used to do that when he was in Geordie, and according to various sources, Bon Scott got the idea to lift Angus Young up on his shoulders after seeing Brian Johnson do that with Geordie's lead guitarist Vic Malcolm. I think it's cool that Bon Scott and Brian Johnson had that mutual respect for each other. Now, of course, Bon Scott tragically passed away too soon. He was 33 when he died on February 19, 1980. What exactly happened to Bon Scott the night of his death? I'm going to be taking a look at that in this video, and in particular, at the end of this video, I'm going to read to you a very detailed statement from Alistair Kinnear. Alistair Kinnear is the last person who saw Bon Scott alive. The official story of Bon Scott's death is that after a night of drinking with Alistair Kinnear, Bon Scott passed out in Alistair's car. Despite Alistair's attempts to wake him up, the AC/DC singer was passed out cold, and so instead, Alistair parked his car by his apartment, covered Bon Scott with a blanket, and left him to sleep for the night. In the morning when Alistair woke up and went to check in on Bon, he found that Bon was still asleep in the car. But he soon realized that Bon wasn't actually asleep, he was dead. And officially, the cause of his death was listed as acute alcohol poisoning, death by misadventure. In addition to his stage presence and his vocal abilities, Bon Scott was also known for his outlandish behavior. He lived the rock and roll lifestyle to the fullest, and ultimately that's what led to his untimely death. Even before Bon Scott was a rock and roll singer, he had a very outlandish personality and was getting into trouble from an early age. As a matter of fact, as a teenager, he spent time in a prison assessment center and later in a juvenile institution. At one point, he tried to join the Australian Army, but was turned down by the Army and labeled socially maladjusted. Long story short, Bon Scott has always been a hellraiser. The last time Bon Scott was ever in the studio was just a few days before his death. In February of 1980, preparations were underway by AC/DC for their next record, the record that would end up becoming Back in Black. Now, there are many rumors and debates out there regarding the degree of Bon Scott's contribution to the record. What we know for sure is that Bon Scott was present for a session on February 15, 1980, where the young brothers Angus and Malcolm were working on the beginnings of 2 songs that would appear on Back in Black. These songs being Let Me Put My Love Into You and Have a Drink on Me. And interestingly, for this session, Bon Scott played the drums rather than contributing vocals. At this point in time, Bon Scott was in England. On the night of February 18th, he went out for a night in the town, and in typical Bon Scott fashion, he had a night of heavy drinking. The drinking predominantly took place at a London club which at the time was called the Music Machine. Today it's known as Coco. Bon Scott was accompanied that night by his friend Alistair Kinnear. As mentioned, the official story of Bon Scott's death is that after this night of heavy drinking, Bon Scott passed out in Alistair's car, and the day after, Alistair Kinnear discovered Bon Scott had died. Officially, the cause of death was listed as acute alcohol poisoning, death by misadventure. Though there are those who were close to Bon that believe his death was not a result of alcohol, but rather a result of heroin. More specifically, this theory suggests that Bon Scott's alleged heroin use that night caused him to vomit and that he choked on his vomit in his sleep. In 2017, author Jesse Fink published a book about Bon Scott titled Bon, the Last Highway. For this book, Jesse Fink extensively researched the circumstances surrounding Bon Scott's death and spoke with many of the people who were close to him at the time. According to some of those people Jesse Fink spoke with, Bon Scott had begun to use heroin around this time in his life. In an interview about his book, Jesse said the following, quote, "Former heroin users know what other heroin users look like, and they made it very clear to me that they had thought Bon had taken heroin that night." End quote. As of yet, no definitive proof has surfaced that heroin was involved with his death that night. Jesse Fink, however, does question the official ruling regarding Bon Scott's passing, even pointing to the fact that Bon Scott's death certificate had inaccuracies on it. Quote, "There's an incorrect address on the death certificate. Why has no one ever picked that up? I was looking at it like, have I got this wrong? No, I'm really looking at a mistake on a death certificate." End quote. Fink goes on to discuss how he believes the official ruling of the cause of Bon Scott's death was rushed and possibly inaccurate. Combine that with the claims from those who knew Bon Scott that said he likely did heroin that night, it does make for a compelling argument that there's more to this story. I want to conclude with a statement from Alistair Kinnear that was released in 2005 for the 25th anniversary of Bon Scott's death. In this statement, he goes into detail about his recollections of that fateful night. Quote, "In late 1978, I met Silver Smith, with whom I moved to a flat in Kensington. She was a sometime girlfriend of Bon Scott. On the night of the 18th of February 1980, Zeneca Cooley, a band manager, invited me to the inaugural gig of her sister's band at the Music Machine. I phoned Silver to see if she wanted to come along, but she made other arrangements for that evening. However, she suggested that Bon might be interested, as he had phoned her earlier looking for something to do. I gave him a call, and he was agreeable, and I picked him up at his flat on Ashley Court in Westminster. It was a great party, and Bon and I both drank far too much, both at the free bar backstage and at the upstairs bar as well. However, I did not see him take any drugs that evening. At the end of the party, I offered to drive him home. As we approached his flat, I realized that Bon had drifted into unconsciousness. I left him in my car and rang his doorbell, but his current living girlfriend didn't answer. I took Bon's keys and let myself into the flat, but no one was at home. I was unable to wake Bon, so I rang Silver for advice. She said that he passed out quite frequently and that it was best to just leave him to sleep it off. I then drove to my flat on Overhill Road and tried to lift him out of the car, but he was too heavy for me to carry in my intoxicated state, so I put the front passenger seat back so that he could lie flat, covered him with a blanket, left a note with my address and phone number on it, and staggered upstairs to bed. It must have been 4 or 5 a.m. by that time, and I slept until about 11. When I was awakened by a friend, Leslie Loades, I was so hungover that I asked Leslie to do me a favor of checking on Bon. He did so, and returned to tell me my car was empty, so I went back to sleep, assuming that Bon had awoken and taken a taxi home. At around 7:30 that evening, I went down to my car intending to pay a visit to my girlfriend who was in hospital, and was shocked to find Bon still lying flat in the front seat, obviously in a very bad way and not breathing. I immediately drove him to King's College Hospital, where Bon was pronounced dead on arrival. The Lambeth coroner's report cited acute alcohol poisoning and death by misadventure. It has since been speculated that Bon choked on his own vomit, but I can neither confirm nor deny this, and his death certificate says nothing about it. There was no vomit in the car, and contrary to other reports I've read, he was not wrapped around the gear stick when I found him. I made a statement to the police at the hospital, and later spoke to the Evening Standard, relating everything I knew at the time. The next day, Silver came around to see me. She told me for the first time that Bon had been receiving treatment for liver damage, but had missed several doctor's appointments. I wish I had known this at the time. I truly regret Bon's death. Hindsight being 20/20, I would have driven him to the hospital when he first passed out, but in those days of excess, unconsciousness was commonplace, and seemed no cause for real alarm. It has been implied that I mysteriously disappeared, but in fact, I have been living on the Costa del Sol, a region of Spain, for 22 years, still working as a musician, and am in touch with most of my old friends in England and in other parts of the world. So I am not hiding from anyone. What I'd like to pass on from this unfortunate experience is the idea that we should all take better care of our friends and err on the side of caution when we don't know all the facts.